Rain came down in sheets, a steady, unkind curtain that turned the avenue into a blur of headlights and reflections. Marcelo's windshield wipers beat a metronome against the world, one sweep, another, while the gate to his estate clicked shut behind him. The rain smelled like old asphalt in winter. It erased hard edges and made the city small and slippery. In a moment so ordinary it could have been any rainy night, something in the dark by the magnolia tree caught his eye. Two figures huddled beneath the skeletal branches, their coats plastered to their backs, a single leather suitcase at their feet. The suitcase had the soft, worn look of an object that had traveled a long way and been loved for years. Marcelo slowed without thinking, the engine idling in the wet gutter of his driveway. He could have eased forward, pressed the gate's electric button, and gone inside to the heat and the fireplace. He had appointments tomorrow, a board meeting, and the kind of calendar that swallowed hours whole. But the sight, two bent shapes under the rain, hands clasped around the handle of that suitcase like a promise, felt like an accusation. A sleek black SUV rolled up behind his car, its lights slicing across the wet pavement. The door opened and a figure stepped out, immaculate even in the rain. Eduardo, sharp in a dark coat that frowned at the weather, the sort of man who wore judgment as a second skin. He glanced toward the couple and then at Marcelo, lips twisting into a smirk that belonged on a magazine cover. "You're stopping for this?" Eduardo asked, rich with disbelief and a taste of amusement. "They look like they belong in the wrong century." Marcelo watched the old man's hands, the way the woman huddled close as if shelter could be physical enough to hold dignity together. He felt a pull in his chest as though he'd been tugged by a memory he couldn't see yet. "We'll get them out of the rain," Marcelo said simply. Eduardo laughed, sharp and unnecessary. "You know how these stories go. One night on the curb, 2 days of pity posts, and then, trust me, the relatives show up asking for interviews, or worse, a file full of claims and signatures that suddenly appear." He snapped his fingers as if the idea were theatrical. "It's better to place them where they belong. Professionals know what to do." Marcelo's fingers tightened on the wheel. Professionals. The word was a shovel to dig graves for inconvenient people. He had looked away before at other things, anonymous donations, discreet foundations, the kind of giving that made the headlines embarrassed of its own modesty. But tonight he couldn't simply turn the key and go inside. The old woman lifted her head. Her hair was silver in the streetlight, and her face held the kind of patient clarity that had nothing to do with youth. There was an unashamed dignity in her look, an expectation that someone would answer when someone needed shelter.
"Thank you, sir," the woman said when Marcelo stepped out. Her voice was soft, warm with a lifetime of small kindnesses. "We were evicted this morning. The house, we thought we could stay with our son, but—" "You came to the wrong hour," Eduardo interjected. "That's what happens when people don't manage their affairs properly. Do you have any identification? Medical records? If they're a danger to themselves or others? Please." The man who stood with her placed his hand lightly at her elbow, not to steady her, but to say she was not alone. His coat was threadbare at the collar. He smelled faintly of tea and the dust of old construction. His posture, even soaked through, carried the quiet confidence of someone who had moved mountains in lighter years. Marcelo reached for the leather suitcase because it seemed the simplest thing to do. The leather was cold and supple and bore small scratches that told of long roads. He expected it to be full of old clothes or perhaps papers, but when he lifted the lid, the interior smelled of cedar and chamomile. Folded inside, atop a neat bundle of travel-worn shirts, was a small envelope, the paper yellowed at the edges. Marcelo's heart stuttered. The handwriting on the outside was a child's, deliberate, earnest, a looping signature he half remembered from the back of an old schoolbook. Before he could think further, the woman, Esperanza, met his eyes. She did not ask for charity. She only offered conversation, as if hospitality were the natural order of things. "We don't want your pity, just a dry place, if it's not too much." Marcelo felt the house like a throat opening up, warmth spilling outward, wood floors that still held the winter of voices, the scent of oil and lemon from the kitchen, a grandmother's quilt folded across the armchair. He heard the kettle clank in some distant room, as if summoned by the small human urgency of tea. He could see the moment in the future, the couple warmed by the fire, their wet coats drying, a place at the table. It would take only a courtesy from him. It would take nothing, and yet it would mean everything. "All right," he said. "Come in." An unadorned one-line CTA flashed in his mind, not a sermon or a billboard, but an honest invitation. If this sounds like the kind of story you want to hear, subscribe for more true life-inspired narratives. It felt oddly appropriate, this small action of sharing stories that change people. But the thought was a flicker. The house's warmth made it seem necessary and trivial at once. They let themselves in. Valdirine, the housekeeper, appeared like a principle of gravity, solid, exacting, offended on behalf of order. She frowned at the sight of the couple, the suitcase, the rain tracked across the hallway rug. "Sir, we have strict rules," she said, eyes narrowing at the wet footprint of tears and rain. "It can't be that hard," Marcelo replied. "Make some tea. Towels."
Valdirine folded into motion, her objections swallowed by practicality. She wrapped 2 steaming towels in a way that felt like an act of sacrament. The kitchen smelled of citrus and wet wool, of toast and something simmering in a pot. The couple moved through the rooms with a gentle dignity, as if they were visiting an old parish house rather than a modern fortress. They accepted the towels and the tea with a grace that made the young man in the suit, Eduardo, watch them like a man sampling someone else's memories and finding them inferior. They settled into the study by the fireplace, the leather suitcase placed carefully at their feet. Marcelo sat opposite them, his palms resting on his knees, wanting to ask questions and to keep still at once. Antonio, thin, with hands that looked built for drawing arches and blueprints, folded his wet coat onto an armchair. Esperanza smoothed her skirt, as if ironing cloth could resolve weather. The fire made every edge softened and raw at once. "Tell me your names," Marcelo said. "Antonio," the man replied. His voice carried the gravel of tools and the melody of someone accustomed to speaking to a class of eager students. "Esperanza." Both names felt like a promise, the name of work and the name of hope. There was a modesty about them that refused the language of victimhood. Their story, when it came, unspooled like a measured narrative rather than a confession. They had been evicted because the house they'd lived in for decades had been sold, a lawyer's letter, a sheriff's notice. Their son, Eduardo, had informed them that their presence was a problem. He had offered to place them in a care facility, citing worries about their memory and safety. He had arranged for a professional assessment to be made swiftly, the sort that pushed people into a system with the speed of paperwork and the cold convenience of forms. Antonio and Esperanza had refused. They had packed what they could, took the leather suitcase and the photographs, and stepped into the rain. Marcelo listened, feeling a strange double vision. The couple narrated their life with quiet pride. Schools built from leftover wages, a small clinic where they had spent evenings treating hungry children, a music program Esperanza ran for years in the community center. The stories were not told as a plea for recognition. Indeed, they seemed almost embarrassed to recount them, but as facts, ordinary and rich. A teacher who taught children to hum before they learned to read. An engineer who stayed behind to supervise the last bricklaying when a budget dried up. At one point, Antonio reached into the suitcase and drew out a small stack of photographs tied with twine. The top photograph was a faded shot of a boy, hair plastered to his forehead, clutching a teddy bear while bandages hugged one arm. Marcelo's breath hitched because the boy in the photograph could have been him, only smaller, cheeks rounder with the stubborn glow of boyhood. The boy's left hand was ink-stained, as if he had been learning to sign something as significant as his life. "This was taken after the accident," Antonio said quietly. "He was made to stay in hospital, no money for the bills. We left a letter at the desk and a check the size of a hope. We didn't want anyone to know. We didn't want thanks." The old envelope Marcelo had noticed in the suitcase lay now in his lap, the yellowed paper that smelled faintly of lavender and old pencils. His pulse beat a dull, insistent drum. It was his name on the outside, written in a child's loop. Marcelo. He recognized the curve of the capital M, the way you recognize a cousin's laugh, familiar and uncanny. "I was small," Marcelo said, his voice brittle in a way he didn't expect. "I don't remember." "You remember the man with the red coat?" Esperanza interjected gently. "You once sat on his knees in a doorway and didn't want to leave. You sang a lullaby in the ambulance. You were given a cup of cocoa when you feared the hospital floors." Marcelo closed his eyes and let memory come like a slow film, a corridor full of muted lights, a woman humming a tune that steadied a breathing body, a pair of hands folding a sweater with the kind of patience that rearranged the world. He had been a child who nearly drowned in a more metaphorical sense, the drowning of a family's small business, a father's job gone, the door that closed on them. Someone had kept water from rising.
Someone had signed a check, bought medicine, placed a friendly hand on a shoulder. He had never been told the name. His parents had always said, "Someone helped," and then changed the topic as if the subject were too tender to revisit. Now the envelope in his hand felt heavy with years, the handwriting a direct line to that night. He hesitated before unfolding it, as if a paper could be a hinge to another life. The pages inside were simple, an account of assistance, a short note to the hospital staff, and a boy's scrawled signature, Marcelo, dated nearly 3 decades ago. The letter's language was modest, a transaction disguised as charity. For the costs of this child's care, it read, in a hand that had not yet matured, "We ask only kindness." A memory cracked open. Marcelo saw himself small and defiant, refusing to be a burden, his mother's shoulders thin in the doorway. A woman, Esperanza, had let him hold the kettle to feel useful. Later, he remembered the evening a pale man had leaned over a ledger and whispered, "We can keep the rent paid this month." That debt, unclaimed and anonymous, had never sat in his bank accounts as a favor. It had been a quiet scaffold on which his family rebuilt themselves. Those small acts had become the scaffolding of his life, the hidden supports that allowed him to study late at night, to invest in an idea that turned into the first company he started with a borrowed ladder and a borrowed tool. The room narrowed into the paper and the names on it.
Marcelo felt the heat of the fireplace and the cold rain pressed to the glass, two opposing climates. He heard, beneath the crackle of wood, Eduardo's voice outside, sharp as icicles. "This will be messy, Marcelo," Eduardo called through the doorway as he entered, with the arrogance of someone who had never had a night under a magnolia tree. "You shouldn't get involved unless you're comfortable being dragged into something public." "Keep your counsel to yourself," Marcelo said. He did not know why his voice had ascended to a tone that surprised him, loose with anger, anchored with something older, a protective current. He stood then not as the owner of a house, but as someone whose life had been shaped, namelessly, by hands now shaken with the wet of rain. Eduardo's smile was a weapon, clinical and clean. "Parents like these," he said for the benefit of anyone listening, "they make sentimental tales for the cameras, but there's a practical side to it. They have assets, they have—" "My parents have nothing to hide," Esperanza said. Her voice was not defensive, but steady, the kind of voice used to teaching a roomful of children to stand tall and use the light within them. "If we had sought to hide anything, we could have kept silent, but we never stopped helping. We never took anything that didn't belong to us." Eduardo stepped forward, flourished a phone like an accuser holding a dossier. "I've already arranged for an assessment. A temporary guardianship can be filed if there's cause. I can arrange care placement tonight. There are legal procedures, Mr. Marcelo, and it's best to leave these things to professionals." The words temporary guardianship landed with the dullness of an inevitable label. Marcelo thought of clinics with fluorescent lights and forms stapled so small a life becomes a docket number. He thought of the leather suitcase left alone outside. He thought of a boy bandaging a teddy bear's arm. Somewhere in the exchange, Marcelo felt the solid line of his own life pull taut and ready to snap or to hold as a bridge. "You won't touch them," Marcelo said, and the statement came out more like a vow than a refusal. "Not while I'm here." Eduardo's eyes narrowed. "With respect, Marcelo, this is delicate. You may not know the full family history. Things will get complicated. There may be documents, claims." "What kinds of documents?" Marcelo asked. The word slipped out. There was no real curiosity in it, more a sense that names and papers had always defined property in this city. "A will," Eduardo said, the single word gleaming. "A set of deeds. People who suddenly remember they always had a right when an estate becomes at stake. I'd advise caution." The suggestion hung between them like an accusation, the implication that the couple were untethered by clear legal claims, that their childhood and good deeds did not translate to anything the courts would honor. Marcelo's eyes dropped to the leather suitcase, the world of their lives packed into the brown shell, and the faint hope that perhaps papers inside could answer or confuse him further. He turned to Antonio. "Is there a will? Is there anything we should know?" Antonio's knuckles were a map of labor. He took a breath like a man who had rehearsed modesty his whole life. "We have letters. We have records of projects we signed and receipts. Small things. But when your son sold the property, the records were moved, misplaced. There were people who said they'd take care, and then the papers became hard to find. So the old man had once been trusted with more than family. He had been trusted with community projects, with the future of a neighborhood school, and the receipts and ledgers of that work had the power to define ownership if anyone looked. That line of fact, the thread of record and testimony,
suddenly made Eduardo's interest clearer and more predatory. "Give me that envelope," Marcelo said. He felt less like a man offering charity than a man answering a debt. He wanted to hold the past's evidence and to understand how it had been used or not used, and whether something more sinister had happened in the margins of those papers. He wanted to know if the anonymous kindness that had once saved his family had been a seed that bore other fruit, land, favor, influence, that might be claimed, stolen, or corrupted by those with menus of lawyers and tastes for control. He slid into the armchair opposite, the envelope on his palm like a fuse. Valdirene hovered in the doorway with her arms folded, as if ready to produce a legal tat at a moment's notice. Eduardo had retreated a few paces but remained close, the setting sun arrogance of a man who believed that social capital was something to mercilessly direct it. Marcelo unfolded the letter again and read the lines aloud, not because the words were shocking, but because he needed the sound to solidify the conclusion that had been forming in the back of his mind. The letter was a small ledger of care, a note to a secretary that some help had been arranged, inscribed with a young hand that could have been any child's, but somehow sat in his memory like an artifact. The signature at the bottom, Marcelo, was not an attempt to be dramatic. It was simply fact. Someone had signed his name as a child. "I remember flashes," Marcelo admitted. "A man with rough fingers who steadied me, the clinic at the corner, someone left money." Esperanza watched him with an expression that looked like relieved sadness. Relief because truth had found a small human witness. Sadness because truth could be messy and its uncovering aroused greed. "We acted because a child needed help," she said. "We never wanted to be known. Our work was for the people." Marcelo felt something steady and fierce rise in him. The city had taught him that most kindnesses were investments, and most investments sought return.
But here was a different geometry. Charity that had wanted no ledger and yet had built a ledger of human lives. He felt the unfairness of Eduardo's casual suggestion of professionals, of the quickness with which his fellow men could reduce a life to a form to be signed away. Who would do this? Eduardo asked, voice sharpened with the first real cut of anger. Who writes letters like that and then claims to be a saint? If there's property involved, it needs to be reviewed. If there are deeds, they must be secured. At that, Marcelo understood the architecture of the threat. Eduardo's eyes glinted. Property, papers, wills. These were not words to carry as accusation, but as instruments of power. They were legal scalpels by which families could be rearranged and old people rendered into quiet disclaimers in a court docket. "Then we will review the records," Marcelo said, "but not while you drag them into a process that will break them. If there's a will or papers, we'll be thorough and fair. I'll find counsel. We'll do it legally." Eduardo's lip curled. "You can hire all the counsel you like, but the courts move faster if you have documents on file. Sometimes an emergency evaluation is enough to place them under guardianship. It's a common thing, practical." "Not practical for them," Marcelo said. He felt anger like a furnace, hot and just. He did not want to play the role of opponent, but he would if necessary. "We will not let anyone take advantage of them." Rodrigo's name surfaced in his mind like a lighthouse, a young man with a steady hand and fierce loyalty, Marcelo's nephew of sorts, and more, someone who had grown up in neighborhoods where Antonio and Esperanza's work had made a tangible difference. If there were records, Rodrigo could find them. If there were misfiled deeds, Rodrigo would know the people who knew the pattern. Marcelo tapped his phone, his thumb dialing the contact he trusted to move quietly but effectively. Beyond the windows, rain continued to glaze the city. The leather suitcase sat like a small island of mystery at their feet. Marcelo put his hand on it again, as if grounding himself. The envelope's yellowed paper felt like a hinge between lives, one of anonymity, one of public consequence. He could not know the whole story yet, but he could hear the first chords of a truth that might rearrange more than a family's evening. "We need time," Marcelo said, and the sentence contained the promise of work, a pause, a promise to investigate, to listen, to not be rushed into easy solutions by anyone, least of all by a man who seemed to see people as either useful or embarrassing. We will review everything. No one moves them tonight. Eduardo left with the kind of glare that promised a long game. He did not storm off. He had the luxury of patience and the certainty of resources. In the driveway, his SUV's taillights were red and steady, a small announcement that the city's power structures were aware and watching.
Patricia watched from the passenger seat with folded hands and eyes that flickered at the edges as if she were two people at once, loyal and uneasy. Inside, the kettle hissed again. Valdirene placed another towel at the couple's feet, like a guardian at a threshold. Marcelo sat with the envelope open and read the letter twice more, as though repetition might reveal a hidden line. The paper told a quiet tale of help. It did not speak of property. Yet the fact that the couple owned nothing overt, their humility had been in the quiet absence of documentation, left them exposed to the kind of legal maneuvers Eduardo's kind specialized in. "You should talk to Dr. Enrique," Rodrigo said when he arrived, breathless not from the run, but from the urgency the city had taught him to carry in his bones. Rodrigo's eyes moved like searchlights. He took in the suitcase, the photographs, the face of a man who had once been a child. Dr. Enrique, Marcelo's lawyer, careful and steady, listened with a patience that felt like a slow machine calibrating itself. "A guardianship can be filed with a judge if there's reasonable cause," Dr. Enrique said quietly, "but it requires medical opinion. If someone's filing false reports, that's a crime. We can file an emergency motion to prevent removal while we gather evidence. It won't be instant. It will take motions, affidavits, perhaps a temporary order. But if there's fraud, if documents are forged or doctors coerced, we can halt proceedings and start an investigation." Marcelo nodded, relief and anger twining at his chest. The law was a long architecture. It could protect, but only if those who wielded it were ready to walk its corridor and not simply slam doors. He expected work. He expected delays. He expected the slow, mechanical noise of bureaucracy and the human work of gathering proof. Antonio sat by the fire and watched the room with eyes that had seen skylines change and little schools rise. Esperanza had wrapped a blanket around her knees. Both of them looked out of place in the house designed for sterile efficiency and quiet opulence. At the same time, they seemed to bring a lightness to the rooms that no wealth could buy. Marcelo felt his own heart, which had once been taught to count assets and margins, tilt toward accounts that could not be captured on a balance sheet. By the time the rain had softened into a constant silver mist, Marcelo had agreed to three things: that no one would remove Antonio and Esperanza from his house, that he would fund a careful legal review, and that Rodrigo would begin looking into property records and municipal ledgers. He had felt old debts inhale and exhale inside his chest. He had felt the curdling of anger toward Eduardo's cavalier suggestion of institutionalization, toward the false civility with which some men had the knack for converting human lives into lines on a spreadsheet. And beneath all of it, there was the letter in his lap, the child's signature like a knot in a rope that tied him to two people who had never asked to be finged. As night settled, Marcelo sat with the letter and the suitcase as if they were relics of a quiet war, a life saved, a life built, and now, perhaps, a life to be defended. Outside, Eduardo's taillights blinked away into the night like a promise of return. Inside, the couple's steady breathing became a rhythm that steadied Marcelo's more frantic pulse. The city hummed around them, traffic like distant surf. He read the letter again, the ink smudged in one corner, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the pull of an obligation that had nothing to do with a boardroom and everything to do with the small facts of human dependency. He did not know how a path that began with a child's signature would move a man like Eduardo from mockery to humility, but he was learning the shape of the story's first curve. When he put the envelope back into the leather suitcase, he found another sheet tucked beneath the photographs, a notation in a different hand, a record of a donation, a stamped receipt from a municipal office. The stamp looked official enough to be a breadcrumb. Marcelo traced the edges with his thumb, tasting suddenly the metallic tang of discovery. The suitcase felt heavier now, the leather absorbing the heat of a hand that had decided not to look away. He closed it gently and placed it near the fire. Outside, rain softened to a mist. Inside, as candles and distant windows blinked like small truths, Marcelo realized that once opened, certain things do not close the same way. He had offered shelter for the night. In return, a letter and a suitcase had offered a history that requested action. He moved to the window and watched the road where Eduardo had disappeared, thinking of all the threads that connect us: gratitude, duty, memory, and how they might be tugged into a fight neither of them wanted to avoid. The only question that remained was how far Eduardo would be willing to push to make silence a profitable policy, and how far Marcelo would go to ensure the past was not stolen again. The kettle hissed one more time. The house seemed to hold its breath. The leather suitcase lay at the foot of the chairs like an unassuming drum, counting a rhythm that would, in time, call others to listen. The leather suitcase sat by the fire like a small percussion instrument, tapping out a rhythm that no one in the room could ignore. Marcelo felt that rhythm as a summons. He did not know yet how many doors he would have to pry open, how many signatures he would need to follow like faint footprints. But he knew the path would not be tidy. It would be a long, slow cleaning of a tangled ledger. Rodrigo arrived before dawn the next day, breathless, hair plastered to his forehead from the rain.
He carried with him a courier's energy, sharp, practical, used to asking for favors of people who were tired of favors. He sat at Marcelo's kitchen table among empty cups and the kettle's warm shadow, and opened his laptop as if it were another kind of tool. "We'll start with the basics," Rodrigo said. "Municipal registries, property deeds, tax receipts, old permits for the clinics and the school. If Antonio signed anything official, there'll be a trace somewhere. Sometimes it's a stamped envelope under a receptionist desk. Sometimes it's an old ledger in a public archive no one digitized." Marcelo handed him the receipt he had found under the photographs, the municipal stamp faded but legible. Rodrigo traced the edges with a fingertip and smiled in the way people smile when a map finally shows a road. "It's a breadcrumb," he said. "Someone kept a copy. That's good. Start at the registry office. I'll call the people who worked at the old school. Marina, she might have records. She remembers the names of the contractors who built the clinic." The name Marina landed like light. Marcelo looked up. "She was the child who grew into a doctor because of their programs," he said. "If she still remembers, she could be the sort of witness courts listen to. She's not only a living testimony, she's a professional." While Rodrigo moved like a scout through public records, Dr. Enrique filled forms and drew a line between professional procedure and moral duty. He drafted an emergency petition to the court, an application to prevent the removal of Antonio and Esperanza while an investigation could be carried out. It would be routine law, slow enough to be mundane, but it offered a firewall against the immediate danger: Eduardo's plan to have them moved under evaluation and then replaced by legal conservatorship. "Emergency motions can be issued quickly if the judge sees imminent risk," Dr. Enrique explained, pinching the bridge of his nose in a way that suggested law cost him something he would rather not pay. "We'll request a temporary restraining order to prevent transfer. We will also ask for an independent medical evaluation, performed by a practitioner chosen by the court rather than by someone Eduardo proposes. If there's evidence of coercion, that's criminal. We'll start with affidavits and see where the facts take us." Affidavits required witnesses. Rodrigo found them. He went to a municipal archive in a narrow building where the air always smelled of dust and glue. A clerk there, young but steady-handed, remembered a pile of receipts that had been filed under Community Projects, 1989-1995. Rodrigo sat with a box and a magnifying glass and spent an afternoon turning brittle pages into a narrative. He found a stamped receipt signed by Antonio for materials bought for a neighborhood school, a letter of thanks from a mayor's office acknowledging volunteer labor, and a ledger with a penciled note referencing a land allotment discussion. Back at Marcelo's house, every discovery felt like a match struck in the dark. The envelope with Marcelo's childlike signature had been one of these small fires. The receipts were kindling. Each paper was a piece in a jigsaw that could either become a picture of truth or be smudged by those who preferred dark images. Rodrigo compiled scans, numbered the pages, and printed them on a rattling office printer. The prints smelled faintly of toner and urgency. Marcelo watched Antonio and Esperanza in those days as if observing a pair of trees that had weathered every storm and still produced fruit. They were careful with their words, reluctant to place their history in legal terms. Antonio's hands trembled sometimes when he reached for a cup, but he never faltered in the dignity of someone who had built things with his hands and his heart. Esperanza hummed little refrains while she sorted the photographs, the sound like a balm. "How does one prove that a life was given?" Esperanza asked once, the question passing as lightly as a teacup being set down. "We have memories and neighbors who remember. We have receipts and photos. We do not have a chest of gold." "You have enough," Marcelo said. He had begun to feel less like a stranger to the couple's history and more like an instrument trying to complete the music they had started. Neighbors remember. Records remember. People have a way of admitting what their conscience already knows. Eduardo watched their efforts with a storm in his eyes, less a man interested in proof than a general plotting an attack. He was patient in the way predators were patient, willing to wait until the right knife could be unsheathed. The first move he made was procedural. He filed papers at the county court requesting an expedited guardianship evaluation. He did not hide the intent. He framed it as a necessity for, quote, their safety. He presented a medical report, a crisp clinical note from a private practitioner, claiming confusion and occasional memory lapses severe enough to warrant placement. Marcelo and Dr. Henrique moved faster. The emergency motion was filed that same afternoon with the local judge. Dr. Henrique requested an independent geriatric assessment and demanded the court allow Marcelo to keep the couple in his home while the investigation proceeded. The judge, a woman with hair like flint and eyes like a ledger that had seen debts paid and unpaid, granted the temporary order, no removal until an independent evaluation could be completed. Eduardo's counsel smirked in the hall as if the first move had not gone as planned, but he had men on retainer who knew how to reshape a loss. He tightened his strategy into two prongs: legal pressure and social humiliation. He began to leak fragments to a local paper, vague hints that Marcelo was embroiled in a family drama, that wealthy men sometimes made choices that served their public image.
He leaned on board members who had financial interests tied to Marcelo's enterprises and whispered the old, rotten idea that charity could be messy. What Eduardo did not account for, either through arrogance or miscalculation, was the slow, crystalline force of testimony. People do not always speak for money or for posture. Sometimes they speak because particular acts had touched them enough to leave a scar. Marina, the physician, who had once been a child in Antonio and Esperanza's program, sat in Marcelo's study with a quiet intensity. "You gave me a book and a stethoscope," she told them, in a voice that sounded as if it had learned to be both precise and gentle. "You, Esperanza, taught me how to listen to a lullaby and then read between the lines of a patient's silence. Antonio taught me how to measure a foundation and how to measure a community's need. They did not do it for recognition. They did it because someone had to. I am indebted." Marina's affidavit was the sort of evidence judges respect, a clear, professional statement that traced the couple's influence in concrete terms. She produced patient lists, school rosters, even a certificate of appreciation sewn into the back of a program from the community clinic's 10th anniversary. Her testimony carried the authority of one who had moved from being a beneficiary to being a professional who worked to heal others. As the evidentiary groundwork grew, Eduardo grew desperate. He called a doctor who had once been associated with a private clinic and asked, more than once, that a report be expedited, that a diagnosis be put in place to make guardianship plausible. Marcelo's team learned of those calls through a leaked voicemail Eduardo had not meant anyone else to hear. The voice on the recording was brisk, confident. The conversation's tone assumed power would yield the thing it wanted. Rodrigo found the clip buried on a backup drive at clinic where a nurse, tired of being asked to fabricate, had made a copy and slipped it to a lawyer she trusted. That voicemail was not a single smoking gun, but it was evidence of intent. It proved that Eduardo had tried to manufacture a narrative by pressuring a medical professional. Combined with Marina's affidavits, with the stamp of municipal receipts, and with the childhood letter's proof of relationship, the picture began to form. This was not merely a family disagreement. This was an attempt to convert a lifetime of quiet service into a commodity to be taken. The first public blow came when a reporter called asking for comment on rumors of the guardianship. Marcelo declined to play into tabloids. Instead, he released a calm, factual statement. He had offered shelter, he had initiated a legal review to preserve the dignity of two elderly people, and he welcomed any scrutiny. "Let the documents speak," he told Rodrigo over the phone. "Let the records say what they must." The documents spoke in pages.
Rodrigo found, in a battered filing cabinet at the old school, an original receipt with Antonio's name and a notary stamp. In a municipal archive, he found a letter from a councilman from decades ago thanking Antonio for supervising a water joint repair after a storm. In a small church office, a volunteer remembered Antonio organizing materials for an after-school program and provided a signed letter attesting to his leadership. These were not merely goodwill notes. They were artifacts that anchored a life of service to institutional memory. Dr. Enrique then did something meticulous. He requested a certified copy of any prior will or testamentary documents on record. The hunt led them to a small notary's office, where a secretary mentioned a sealed envelope left by someone who had asked the office to hold a copy of a will until the time it should be private. The envelope had been filed under undelivered correspondence. It had been overlooked for years, a bureaucratic omission rather than a conspiracy. The office produced a photocopy. They had no original, but the photocopy bore the notary seal and an annotation, received for safekeeping. The copy, plastified and smudged along the edges, contained language that surprised them all. It was not a grand legal manifesto. It did not spell out a vast estate. It was instead a modest, carefully worded declaration of intent. Antonio and Esperanza named certain plots of land they had been entrusted with for community projects and expressed a desire that those lands be used for social good: schools, a clinic, housing for needy families. The document did not use legalese to pronounce heirs. Rather, it conveyed the couple's hope that, should they be unable to manage these projects, the community that had benefited from them should be able to steward the land. That photocopy proved critical. Eduardo had been counting on the absence of paperwork to claim that there was nothing to account for. The plastified copy turned that absence into evidence of intention. If these lands had been part of a community trust, then Eduardo's attempt to sell or leverage them could be contested. Dr. Enrique slid the photocopy across the table like a promise and added it to the dossier. At this point, Eduardo, feeling the walls narrow, moved to character assassination. He held a luncheon at a private club and invited a small circle of journalists and board members to suggest that Marcelo was using the couple to bolster his philanthropic image. He produced a slew of innocuous, if pointed, text messages, chopped and framed, to suggest collusion. Patricia stood beside him, her face taut with the defensiveness of someone who had learned to present certainty as armor. Patricia's armor began to pit when she found on Eduardo's phone one evening, while searching for an address, a string of messages that did not fit the narrative he promoted.
They were not legal, but they were human. A terse exchange with the doctor, a short note about arrangements, followed by a payment confirmation to a clinic account. She had always told herself that business was business and family matters were separate. But the payment confirmation had a line item that made her stomach twist: evaluation fee. The context was ambiguous, but the shadow it cast was not. Patricia had married into a culture where success was proof and doubt was weakness. The message forced a question she had been taught to ignore. She slept badly. She replayed a memory of herself as a child, when her mother had knelt beside a neighbor with a fever and held a cup of tea while the neighbor's teeth chattered. The memory prickled. Patricia's conscience, an old, unpolished thing, had begun to scratch at her. She carried the phone across the hallway and tossed it into a drawer, as if that could ignore the evidence. The drawer made no promises. In the end, it was not evidence alone that moved Patricia, but an unexpected meeting. She came to Marcelo's home under the pretense of a diplomatic visit. The house smelled of lemon and wet wool, and Esperanza offered her a cup of tea without contempt. There was no need. Patricia had expected a set piece. She found instead a small woman who squeezed her hands without pity or accusation. "I thought I knew the ways of the world," Patricia said later, standing near the study where the leather suitcase lay under the lamp. "I thought my husband was protecting the family." Her voice broke a little. "When I saw the message and then your paper, Rodrigo showed me a receipt. Something inside me said this was wrong." Marcelo watched her as if watching a door open. "There is a right way to do things," he said. "There is also a wrong way. Sometimes the line between them is thin, and sometimes people choose the wrong because it's easy. If you have something to say that helps the truth, say it without fear." Patricia did not offer the evidence in a flourish. She brought Eduardo's phone the next morning and surrendered it to Dr. Enrique under oath. The messages were not a confession, but they were a piece of the pattern, a sequence of payments, a suggestion of a hurried arrangement, and then a string of curt messages telling a doctor what to write. Eduardo's reaction when Patricia stopped defending him was something like being struck by weather. He tried to argue the point, to bargain, to spin a different tale. Stress, a misinterpreted conversation, a noble intent gone clumsy. But friends and allies had a way of keeping accounts. Once a whisper moves beyond the threshold of familial protection into the public ledger, those accounts begin to reconcile. The legal confrontation that would come to be known as the hearing was not a Hollywood trial. it did not unfold in the ornate grandeur of a courtroom drama.
It was a chambered meeting in a municipal office where officials listened to affidavits and where the photocopy of the testamentary note lay in a stack of papers with a sheen that made it look more sacred than it was. Dr. Enrique presented documents in organized piles: the municipal receipts, the notary's photocopy, Marina's medical affidavit, the nurse's recording, Patricia's surrendered phone messages, and a sworn statement from a clinic assistant who said she had been offered money to provide a favorable report. Eduardo sat across from them, the tailored suit that had been his armor now feeling too tight. He tried to interrupt. He tried to make the conversation about Marcelo's motives, rather than about the facts. He suggested theatrics, questions about reputation, but the officials listened without a flavor for drama. They were interested in procedures, in whether an attempted guardianship had been engineered, and whether a criminal inquiry should be opened into the alleged attempt to procure false medical reports. The turning point came when Rodrigo, who had been quiet that morning, produced something else: a small, sloppily folded piece of paper, another photocopy he'd found tucked between pages in an old municipal ledger. It was an expense voucher with a handwriting match. The signature looked like Antonio's, the numerals aligned in the deliberate way an engineer's hand arranges figures. Alongside the voucher was a typed note from a contractor, referencing specific labor done to the parcel of land where the couple's projects had once stood. The convergence of ledger, photograph, and notary copy made an argument that could not be dismissed as nostalgia. It argued for the existence of a civic promise made long ago. People forget things, Eduardo spat. Papers go missing. That doesn't mean deeds belong to anyone else. My parents entrusted me. Did they? Marcelo cut in, voice steady. Or did they trust the community? The papers we've brought show community stewardship, collective management. They show records of materials purchased, community acknowledgements, and a notary's safekeeping of intent. The official in the room folded his hands. We will open an inquiry into the alleged fraud, allegations of coerced medical reporting, and attempts to misappropriate property. We will order an independent audit of the filings connected to the properties in question. He looked at Eduardo. In the meantime, any actions to transfer assets, sell parcels, or obtain guardianship must be stayed pending the conclusion of the inquiry. Eduardo's face, for the first time in a long while, lost its practiced composure. A hot, human expression crossed his features, fear more than shame, though shame followed. He tried to stand, but the room's gravity held him to his chair. The hearing's clerk spoke gently. Proceedings could be public, and the record was not kind to those who had tried to shape reality to their own ends.
Outside the municipal building, cameras had begun to cluster. Someone had alerted a journalist who liked these kinds of stories, the ones where wealth and moral failure collided. The headline the next morning was not a scream, but a careful ledger. Inquiry opens into possible fraud, guardianship attempt. There are moments in a man's life when presence of witnesses is both curse and mercy. It was in that glare of cameras that Eduardo made his worst misstep. He attempted to step forward toward the podium and make a statement in his own defense, an impulsive public theater that often works for men who feel secure in their standing. But people do not perform well when the stage is less friendly than they expect. As he read from a printed statement, his voice shook. The words meant to salvage his image instead exposed him, like the light of an unflattering bulb. "It was for their safety," he said. "I only wanted what was best." "You were choosing for them rather than listening to them?" a reporter asked. "Who decides what best is, Mr. Eduardo?" The question landed with a clarity that drained color from his face. Patricia stood at his side like a ghost. Her grip on his arm was something between defiance and grief. Supporters muttered, critics applauded. But the truth, like water, finds its way down into cracks. Evidence had been collected, witnesses existed, the notary seal had been found. Eduardo's network of influence, which had seemed like solid ground under his feet, began to tremble. The next public moment, what would be referred to in neighborhood conversation as the exposure, happened at a small press briefing called at Marcelo's request. Marcelo could have hidden behind lawyers and statements. He chose something different. He stood before a scattering of microphones, the leather suitcase beside a speaking podium like an accidental relic, and invited only the necessary people: the investigators, Dr. Enrique, Marina, Rodrigo, Patricia, and the mayor's representative who had once written that letter of thanks. "We've brought documents," Marcelo said simply. "We've gathered testimony. We do not want to punish so much as to restore. The papers you see here show a life of service and an intention to keep community resources in community hands." He opened the leather suitcase then, and the camera pans caught the motion. The same yellowed envelope, the same photographs, the same receipts. The suitcase had gone from being a symbol of travel to a chest of testimony. Marcelo began to place pages on a table, copies, seals visible, dates legible. The plastified copy of the notary's note was the last. Someone from the mayor's office read from a notebook. It was the intent of Antonio and Esperanza that these parcels be used for the common good. Marina added her voice. These projects saved lives. They were not for sale. When the assembled evidence was presented publicly, something like a moral algebra unfolded.
Eduardo's attempt to frame the issue as an inconvenient family matter collapsed under the weight of paper and witness and sound reason. People do not like to be shown where they misused influence. They like it even less when the misused influence becomes their signature. The humiliation for Eduardo was not a theatrical fall from a ladder, but a progressive unmasking. His board members, who had once been useful, started to distance themselves politely. A columnist who had praised him for his acumen wrote a careful piece about accountability. Patricia's decision to step away from his defense felt like a physical removal of oxygen. The sum total of small acts, friends who would not answer calls, financial managers who would not take meetings, a lawyer who advised caution, made Eduardo feel the world narrow until it became a room. At the municipal inquiry, when officials reviewed the evidence, one particularly damning exchange emerged. A recorded voicemail between Eduardo and a physician where he used a phrase that suggested payment was being discussed. The voice was brittle with entitlement. The doctor responded in a tone that wanted to be professional, but was edged with the sound of someone being offered something awkward. That voicemail, clear and unaltered, opened the door for a criminal referral for attempted fraud and coercion. Being called to account is a different thing than being physically broken. For Eduardo, there was ruin, and then there was the possibility of a personal collapse. He began to understand in the slow arithmetic of consequences that money could not instantly mend the moral ledger he had torn. In the quiet of his expensive car, under the rain that had once become his smirk, he felt the old armor no longer fit. He came to the house one night differently. He did not storm in. He did not wear the practiced mask. He came with a face raw and new. He entered through the back, where Valderrene was mending the hem of a curtain. She looked up, measured him with a professional glance that had nothing to do with class, and then, as if with a small mercy, handed him a towel. Antonio and Esperanza were in the sitting room, the lights soft, a music box playing a tune that had once taught a neighborhood chorus to keep time. Eduardo stood in the doorway like a man who had walked across a field and found his footing gone. He did not use the language of pride. He used a far harder language that men seldom master: apology. "I was wrong," he said haltingly. "I thought I knew what was best. I thought the world would grant me the right to decide. I was cruel." Antonio's eyes were steady. He had spent a life building things. He had been present at occasions when men apologized and then returned to their ways. He listened without drama. "You did not listen to us," Esperanza said simply. That hurt. There was no magnanimity in her voice, merely truth. But there is also the work to be done. Eduardo's shoulders shook then. He faltered forward and sank to his knees in front of them, a gesture heavy with both shame and a craving for absolution. It was not theatrical. It was the collapse of a man who had been carried by a certain wind, and who now, on the ground, could only ask to be carried by another kind of wind, one that moved by work and by reparation. The cameras by now were not present. This was not the publicized kneel some men perform on a stage. This was private and raw. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," he said. "I don't expect it. But if there is a way to make amends, tell me. I will do the work." Forgiveness in the narrative Marcelo had always imagined was not cheap. Antonio did not say, "You are forgiven," like a sentence handed down. He placed a hand, calloused and warm, on Eduardo's shoulder. "Forgiveness is for those who are willing to change," he said, "and change is work." Eduardo's path did not snap into righteousness overnight. The municipal inquiry recommended a criminal investigation. Prosecutors opened files. A slower legal machinery began to turn. The court issued temporary restraining orders preventing the transfer of the parcels. Eduardo faced fines and the possibility of charges if the allegations of attempted fraud were proved. Yet in the private rooms where men learned to change, he enrolled in counseling, in community service, and more importantly, he began to see, through the patient work of other people, what it meant to serve rather than to own. Marcelo, not content to leave the matter at punishment, used his resources for restoration. The lands the couple had once stewarded were not grand estates to be parceled and sold for profit. They were simple tracts of community value. Marcelo purchased an adjacent parcel with his personal funds and offered it as seed capital. He gathered Marina, Rodrigo, community leaders, and a cadre of volunteers. The plan they drew was modest and ambitious: housing for elderly neighbors who had no family, a clinic that would be open to low-income patients, a school with a music and vocational program, and a community center that would preserve the couple's memory. They called it Villa Esperanza. The construction was slow in ways that mattered: community consultations, employment of local contractors, transparency about funds. Marcelo insisted on public audits, on a governance structure that included neighborhood representatives, so the projects could not be quietly appropriated by any single benefactor. He refused to place his name on the plaque. The idea was that the village would be a collective thing, a mutual enterprise that translated the couple's quiet generosity into sustained community infrastructure. There were tensions. Some board members wanted a faster, more headline-grabbing project. Marcelo deferred.
He listened to the elders, to those who had been in the neighborhood when Antonio had swept its streets, and to Marina, who insisted that the clinic be suited to treat not just bodies, but to teach young medical assistants, ensuring continuity of care. When the first ribbon was cut, it was a low-key affair: a modest crowd, a local choir that Esperanza had once conducted, and neighbors who brought small cakes as if inaugurations were also an exchange of recipes. Antonio, leaning on a cane, but upright with the dignity of someone who had built things for years, and Esperanza, radiant in a scarf that seemed to have absorbed the sun, stood side by side. Marcelo watched from the back, hands folded, a man who had learned the weight of obligation and who had learned also the curative tendency of work done in common. Patricia stood to one side, not at Eduardo's elbow, but in a place of her own. She had separated herself from the marriage publicly, choosing to work with Lisbon's community organizations, and had taken to volunteering at the school. Her decision was not dramatized, it was a quiet realignment. Eduardo had joined a program at the community center. He spent mornings with builders learning to lay bricks, and afternoons in a counseling group exploring how entitlement hollows a person's humanity. At the opening, Marina spoke of the children who would sing and of the patients who would find a steady hand. She told a small story, one that was simple and devastatingly beautiful. A child once came into the clinic with a fever and a half-promise of hope. A blanket was wrapped around him by a woman who hummed like she knew the secret of consolation. That child is now a doctor. That doctor is here. That is how legacies work. The leather suitcase had a place in the ceremony. It sat quietly on a table near the entrance, open now and empty, save for the yellowed envelope folded inside. Marcelo had placed the envelope there because some things needed to be visible. The fact that gratitude can be anonymous, the fact that small acts can ripple like rings. People came to lay their hands on the suitcase as if it were a relic of a different religion, one devoted to human kindness. The final legal notes, when they arrived months later, read like careful sentences that did not aim for grandeur. The inquiry recommended charges be pursued against those who had attempted to coerce medical professionals and to manipulate the guardianship process. Prosecutors moved to file. A judge reinforced protective measures for the couple's parcels pending final adjudication. Eduardo faced penalties. He also faced the work of restoration. The city, which had once seemed to only reflect social currency in glossy advertisements, learned another lesson through a small group who refused to let paperwork erase people. People who had been beneficiaries of Antonio and Esperanza's work testified in court.
Marina returned and spoke of a life saved by teachers who taught song before letters. Rodrigo, at 30, gave a testimony with a clarity that suggested his loyalty was older than fear. Patricia offered her phone, clean and unweighted by the rhetoric of defense. The court listened, measured, then acted as institutions do, slowly, sometimes painfully, but with the capacity to repair when fed with honest evidence. In the months that followed, Eduardo's fall and tentative rise became a study in humility. He was not punished in a way that satisfied bloodlust. He was required to account for actions, to face the consequences, and to inhabit the smallest of those consequences with sincerity. He worked in the construction crews, learned the weight of a brick, and sat in a circle with men who asked painful questions and did not allow easy rhetoric. He wrote letters of apology, sometimes personal ones, sometimes public statements that acknowledged missteps without grandstanding. That his posture was unsteady mattered less than that he had chosen to tilt towards work. Antonio and Esperanza lived with a measure of peace. The couple's reputation, once threatened by a son who saw their life as a ledger entry, now expanded into a legacy that spread like seeds, a place where children learned both music and carpentry, where the clinic did more than heal wounds, and where elderly neighbors had dignity and a place to sit in the sun. People came from blocks away to volunteer because they saw the truth of what a life of giving could yield. One evening, as the village grew, Marcelo walked with Antonio along a path newly paved by volunteers. The sun lowered itself into a palette of copper and honey. Children chased each other with the reckless joy of those who have safe streets. The clinic's windows glowed with the soft light of exams done well. A small choir practiced a partly forgotten hymn that Esperanza had reintroduced, and the air carried fragments of melody. "You did not have to go so far for us," Antonio said, not as a complaint but as an observation. Marcelo smiled with a quiet that had learned to measure generosity differently. "I did not go for you alone," he replied. "I went because I could no longer count my life in shares and margins. There was a weight in me, an old debt perhaps, that needed attention. Yours simply made it visible." Antonio patted his sleeve. "You made the work possible. But remember, this must not become another display for the rich. A village is for those who live in it." Years later, when children asked about the leather suitcase and the yellowed letter placed now under glass in a small case in the community center, the elders told the story not as a tale of scandal, but as a lesson. They spoke of how wealth is measured in the measure of lives kept whole, how humility can arrive in the form of a man on his knees who then chooses to rise by labor, not by avoiding it. They told how a letter, signed by a child's hand, once carried enough human truth to shape a man's conscience. Eduardo returned to the community in different clothing, a simple shirt and hands calloused by honest labor. He did not stand at the podium at the village's broader inauguration, but instead handed out water to workers, mended a fence, sat with a boy who feared exams, and explained the small calculus of persistence. Sometimes he would catch Marcelo's eye and nod, a gesture of solidarity rather than of social triumph. He had not been absolved of consequence, but he had been offered a path to reparation. At the core of Villa Esperanza's mission remained the couple's quiet ethic, service without spectacle, the insistence that neighborhoods could be held in trust by those who lived within them. The village's plaque read simply, in the local language and then in English, "For the people who serve without being seen, for the hands that build the future." One night, years after the rain that had started everything, Marcelo stood alone near the center's small garden. He watched Antonio and Esperanza walk slowly across the courtyard, their hands linked the way they always had been. A breeze moved through the leaves like a phrase being completed. The leather suitcase was now an exhibit, its edges worn, the yellowed letter sealed in a frame so children could point and make stories of their own. Marcelo remembered the weight of the first time he had unfolded that paper and felt his life change. He had been a man who counted in ledgers. The city had taught him to do that. He had learned, over the course of a suitcase and a season of reckoning, that accounts are not merely monetary, they are moral. They keep track of kindnesses unseen and wrongs that must be righted. He realized that wealth's deepest test is not whether it can allow a man to be generous in public, but whether it can compel someone to act when no cameras watch. From a distance he heard a faint tune, Esperanza leading a practice, voice steady and small. The sound made something in him uncoil. He thought of forgiveness, the slow, muddy river of it, not the champagne of instant absolution. He thought of Eduardo on his knees, of Patricia's trembling honesty, of Rodrigo's small, tireless labor over dusty ledgers. He thought of Marina, who had once been a child and had become a professional who returned to heal. Outside the city lights, rain showed up sometimes, softer now, like a memory acknowledging that once upon a night, the same weather had been an invitation. Marcelo found his hand unconsciously resting on the case that held the yellowed envelope. He did not need to touch it to feel the impress of that child's handwriting. The looped M was a knot in time that had tied him to people he had never known he owed. He did not know what the future would demand. Legal matters would continue in slow, rational maze. The community would find new challenges. People would always be tempted by shortcuts, but there was now an example, a village of small, steady things, and a man who had chosen to use his resources not to hide a past, but to honor it. As dusk settled and the village's lights blinked on, Marcelo watched Antonio and Esperanza walk beneath a magnolia, one they had once planted in a different season. They paused under its growing lens and looked up at the leaves, as if reading a scripture that involved only wind and green. Eduardo, further down the path, bent at the waist to tie a shoelace for a child, a small, humble service that no headline demanded. Marcelo closed his eyes, breathed in, and remembered the rain that had started it all, a night that had been ordinary until he chose otherwise.